So what event in Shakir Ali's career do you feel constituted the jump from an extremely talented modernist to one of Pakistan's greatest, perhaps?
In my opinion, I don't think there is an event, but it is the time and the place he was in the 50s and the 60s that propelled him into this sort of, into the limelight, as well as gave him the opportunity to evolve in the way that he did, with all his innovation in terms of modernist ideas. Shakir Ali was very influential for the younger artists that were starting out at that time. That included people like Shamsa, and others, Shamsa, and then there was Moin Najmi, and quite a few others. And that's because that Shakir Ali had the advantage of living in the West and studying at some of the best institutions over there during the 50s. And that gave him that advantage because all the others had not traveled. They were really looking at the modernist idiom in a different way. That is, they were receiving it through the books. And I remember once when I was interviewing Sousa, he said the same thing, that they had never met a modernist or traveled at that time when they were starting out. But it was through the images that came to them, reproductions, color plates, that they familiarized themselves with the whole, the movement, and wanted to sort of take it as a point of departure and move on with their own version of this language. So Shakir Ali, with that advantage, as you know, he went to Slade School. He was he studied in Czechoslovakia, in Paris, with a Cubist, a well-known Cubist artist. So all this gave him the advantage. And he came back to Lahore, was able to talk to the local artists, have discussions with them, and provide them with the information they did not already have. So I think in that way he proved instrumental, not only for the movement, modern art movement of Pakistan, but also for himself, because then he was sparring and sort of brainstorming and exchanging ideas that gave him that sort of impetus, his art, that impetus, yes.
So Shakir Ali's life and work is not particularly well documented, whether it's in the form of video or print publication. In your personal opinion, why do you think that might be?
Firstly, Shakir Ali was not very prolific. So a lot of his work was, the body of work is smaller. A lot of his work went into private collections or was in his own collection, as we can see at the Shakir Ali Museum. And for him, it was always about the aesthetic problem. And he took it stage by stage, and he connected his work to his personal experience as well. His body of work, I think, grew out of his own experience. And like a lot of other artists, but for him, there were works that were well thought out and fewer works that he did. And because of that, I feel that could be one of the reasons that the works are so scattered, other than what he has at the museum. Secondly, I don't think he courted any of the establishment. He was a recluse, a taciturn man who, despite being in the influential position of the principal of the National College of the Arts, but I think while his art was concerned, he was very sort of, later on, when he was the principal, he was very retiring, very taciturn. I remember talking to Zahurul Akhlaq about Shakir, and he said Shakir Ali would, with his peers maybe he would sort of impart a lot of information earlier on, as we talked about. But later on in his life, with his students, he was not very expressive. He tried to say things in very few words, and he was very self-involved in his work. So maybe, that might have something to do with the lack of documentation. But on the other hand, when we see that he was the principal of the National College of the Arts, one wonders why having been in that pivotal position, let's say a definitive book has not come out on his life and his works. But I think National College Library does have some of his documents, so a body of information is available there. That's what I remember talking to some people about. Maybe in the future something will come out. But he himself was a writer. By the way, he wrote on modernism in Urdu. And there were a lot of Urdu writers that did exchange ideas with him. And they're all, in various writings.
So, what would you say are the first words that sort of come to mind when you view a typical Shakir Ali piece? What characterizes his work? What makes it easily recognizable for somebody that might not be as experienced an art connoisseur as yourself? And of course, what do you feel is his greatest contribution to Pakistani art theory and practice, as opposed to stylistically his contribution?
I think that Shakir Ali's work is really divided into three periods. One is when he was, let's say, working in the language of Cubism, like Braque almost. He was investigating that idiom. Then later on, when you see the work during the late 50s to early 60s, that work, when he did Leader and the Swan and other work, that's very expressive. There's almost this angst in it. And then later on, during the 60s, when some of his best work can be seen, then there is a kind of, let's say, a joy in his work. He uses the red, a lot of, female figures that he sort of paints with a lot of kind of emotive connection. And then, of course, his later body of work in the 70s, that is again a very formal. He's looking at space. But throughout, the one thing that connects his work is his use of space, as well as the way the economy of lines, the way he reduces the form to the minimal number of strokes and tries to capture the essence of a form and the bare structure of that form, just by indicating certain planes or facets of the form. And I think this is the way he looked at the human body as well as plant life and objects. So for him, his investigation really was to pair the object or the form to the minimum number of lines and planes. And that also for the viewer gives a space to enter his work, because then you read what he is working at and you enter into it and enjoy the space and the new structure or form that he creates.
So did you ever have any personal interactions with him while he was still around here in Pakistan? Anything you might remember best about those interactions? We really want to get at what kind of a person he really was, as opposed to maybe the kind of art that he produced.
Well, actually, when I met him in the 70s, he was a very quiet person. And I met him in a very formal setting as I was an art student. He had come to give a lecture and we got to sort of have a short chat with him, which was an honor, because for us, he was, such a larger-than-life figure. But I was introduced to his art much before, because the lady he married, Daphne, was a family friend. And quite often in her first husband's house, we were also close friends of my parents, we would go and see those huge red paintings of his. And I remember being quite moved by those works. They were very strong, those works, in red quite often. And then later on, I heard more about him, and then when I came into visual arts, of course, I had a chance to meet him. But I would have liked to sit and maybe interview him, because by the time, I really came in into art writing and art criticism, he had passed away. So, you know, he died quite early actually, and quite suddenly.
So some artists have an incredible natural affinity for producing new and dynamic work over and over again over the course of their career, sort of building on previous experiments, previous exhibitions. Do you think Shakir Ali's work was more talent than it really was hard work as such? Or do you feel that the quality of his work maybe deteriorated a lot, like a lot of Pakistani contemporary artists? The accusation is that their work deteriorates in quality after the 70s and the 80s, now into a much more commercial era?
Actually, I would agree with that. I think every artist has his peak. And then when he feels he has reached that peak, some of them, like Zahoorul Akhlaq, go into go and investigate some other area and try and look for another peak. And some people recognize that one major peak as the main peak of their lives, and they really don't have much to do after that. So I think every artist works differently. And the more curious you are, the more you continue to investigate new areas and create new peaks for yourself. And as we all know, Picasso is one of them. He constantly reinvented himself. So when we come and talk about Shakir Ali, I think Shakir Ali was a cerebral artist. To him, the intellect and the aesthetic were closely connected. So he was always investigating something. And he did not always, he was not just enamored by the idea of painting, but he was, when you look at his work, it is also about questioning the form that he's painting and the whole struggle to create a new language, a new vocabulary for himself. So I think the intellectual side of Shakir Ali was very developed. And so he did not feel the need to constantly paint and discover the work through the act of painting. It was more an aesthetic problem. He set it for himself and then worked through that. So that is why his body of work is quite consistently good. And you do not see that kind of lapse in it. But also we must remember he died young. And when you pass away young, you cannot really say that, if he had continued to live for another 30, 40 years, what kind of work would he have produced? But I think knowing Shakir Ali's work, I think he would have continued to do the same. Only working when he felt he wanted to sort of resolve some issue that he was sort of mulling over.
So what would you say is your favorite period of his work, while describing maybe a little bit about why you enjoy it as much as you do and why it might be your favorite? And at the same time, for the novice art enthusiast who's out there to try and take in Shakir Ali and get to see some of his pieces, where would you recommend the best publicly accessible venue where one might be able to see his work?
Actually, I like the exuberance of his 60s paintings. I think that was a time when he was less inhibited in his use of color. There's a profusion of color in his work. There is a happiness, a joyousness of sort. He's celebrating, because this is a time when emotionally also he was in a happy mood. He had just got married to Daphne, and he was happy. Life did not seem such a struggle to him at that point. So that is conveyed through his work. Those canvases, he's also painting the female figure, and quite often the sort of a pregnant female. So the work is very emotive. It's connected to his life, and I think that's the time Shakir Ali really let his guard down, so to speak, and let himself emerge through his work. While in a lot of other work, it's very formalist, it's very cerebral. I would prefer the work in which you see the real Shakir Ali, the joyous Shakir Ali. although, as we discussed earlier, consistently his work is of high quality, and whenever you see any of his work, it is compelling, you're drawn into it, and it is always aesthetically strong. So, you know, he was a man who set high standards for himself. And talking about where the work is available, he's the only artist. We talked about documentation earlier. He's the only artist a master in Pakistan who has his own museum, which is the Shakir Ali Museum in Lahore that has been set up by the PNCA. And the work is shown you know, in the setting of his own home, because it is his home that he had built, that has been, you know, bought over by PNCA, and then a museum has been set up in it with all his personal things and the way he liked to, you know, sort of lay out things in the house, the furniture that he got built, you know, working closely with the craftspeople. So a lot of Shakir Ali is present in that environment. And then his work has been, I think, conservation work has been done on some of his paintings, and they're all there on display. Because this studio was really, I think, at the lower level, and that had been affected by floods and rain. So a lot of that work has now come up. It's a very interestingly designed house in Lahore, and I think everyone who's interested in art should visit that. Now it's a little tucked away with a lot of, you know, houses around it. But I remember going to it in the 70s when, you know, it was more exposed, and Shakir Ali was very involved in the designing of the house. So you see everything over there, you know, the way he thought, his own thought process, aesthetic thought process is present.
If you could name maybe 2 or 3 artists, and purely from a personal preference point of view, 2 or 3 artists, Pakistani artists especially, South Asian artists, that fall into the same sort of league as Shakir Ali, in your personal opinion, who would you say?
Local artists or foreign artists?
Local artists.
Well, I would say his student Zahurul Akhlaq is one of them, because in some ways he inherited the mantle of Shakir Ali, and he was almost like an adopted son of Shakir Ali. They lived together, and Shakir Ali helped him evolve into the great artist and the great contemporary artist that he became. And he too was a cerebral artist. There was a lot of intellectual sort of questioning through his work, and I think he's one of them. If you look at that particular trajectory that, you know, Shakir Ali sort of was at the head of, I think that's one. And then we have a lot of other artists, and I think from Zahurul Akhlaq we come to his 2 students. One is Shazia Sikandar, and the other one is Rashid Rana. And I think both of them have continued that whole stream of questioning and approaching art, you know, intellectual